Hello and welcome to Brandtuned, Successful Brand, Successful Business, the show for entrepreneurs and brand creators where we discuss personal and business branding to give you ideas and inspiration for your own brand. I'm Shireen Smith, lawyer, entrepreneur, author, and advocate for developing purpose-based brands to change the world. Theo Williams is a designer and creative director whose career has included being head of design at John Lewis Home via his role at Habitat, which followed on from Sir Terence Conran and Tom Dixon. He describes his superpower as one of provoking new and better ways of thinking so retailers and brands can better realize their goals. But let's hear from Theo himself. Tell us a bit more, Theo, about your background and how you moved into design, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you very much for having me. My background, essentially I'm an industrial designer. I went to art college. I followed the normal degrees and foundation courses, and took a course in Manchester in industrial design, which I then changed to art. And then I switched back to graphic design, and then I switched back to industrial design through a series of events. So essentially I call myself just a creative, really. I studied in Manchester, but I was in Manchester one day and I discovered that probably what they were teaching me on industrial design was everything I didn't want to know, or the process at least. I saw a Philips Stark lemon squeezer in a shop one day by Alessi back in the late 80s, 89, 90. And it was everything the opposite of what I was being taught. And it was crazy, too expensive, didn't work, but it looked lovely. So I decided to go there, and that was based in Milan. And of course, there was no Google in those days. So I went to scroll through the library in Manchester, eventually got a plane. I went to Milan in 1991. I think I was 23. And I ended up staying there for 15 years. Basically carried my portfolio around, this huge, great thing. And I went knocking on all the doors in alphabetical order of all the architects and designers that I'd ever read about, from Castiglione to Andrea Branzi to Sotsas and Marco Zanusso and Aldo Civic and everybody else. I ended up working for a few architects. I basically grew into a little shared studio, and I continued from there. And I ended up with probably 12 people in a studio at one point. And then I was picked up and transported to Amsterdam for a job I couldn't turn down, to take over a company called Mex in Amsterdam, whilst keeping the studio alive in Milan. And after a period of 3 years in Amsterdam, as I was moving back to Milan, I got a call from Habitat to become creative director for them, which I did for 5 years, based in London, obviously. And then John Lewis had been chasing me for a couple of years. And when Habitat folded, or eventually the IKEA group sold them on, I jumped ship to John Lewis as creative head for Home for 3 years. And then after leaving there, I pretty much set up on my own for a couple of years. And then another job came around, Kingfisher Group, the PLC owned B&Q, the likes of Screwfix, Castorama, Brico Dépôt, the third biggest retailer in the world for the DIY department. They took me on board for 3 years, which I finished last October as design director, essentially building up their internal studios around the world to design own product design and rebrand their new own brand product assortment. So essentially that's what I do. I've designed things from packaging for Armani to Ferragamo. I've designed products for Alessi. I've designed all the cardio fitness equipment for Techno Gym, all the way up to designing brands for John Lewis. And so essentially I call myself a creative, and I've moved in a direction that I've wanted to see the products I design packaged and sold and marketed and displayed in the same tone of voice that I designed them in. So I've kind of crept into this branding over all the years. And that's where I find myself now, kind of doing everything from the product all the way up to the visual identity.
Oh, I see. So essentially, you've been involved both as an employee and in your own businesses throughout your life. So it's not like you were an employee and then moved away into.
No, I think that's one of the benefits is that I've seen both sides. I've seen what big budget clients are like from both sides of the table, and when I'm working in full time, I've also handed out these types of jobs to freelancers and the studios, as well as being the receiver of those now. So that's been definitely beneficial, being in and out both ends.
So you were branding these designs that you came up with. What did that involve generally? I mean,
Well,
what?
I'll give you a good example of a company, Lexon in Paris. They have initially, we got together back in the sort of 95 to the end of 2000, around there, and initially to design products for them. But then, of course, I'd start questioning the packaging, the displays, the logo, the communication, the catalogue. And that was my first big creative job, where I oversaw everything for about 4 years, which touched that brand, including rewriting their mission statements, what they stand for, their values, etc. So I kind of moved generally in that direction, where I could see the longer term vision for a brand rather than just focusing on the product. And it occurred to me that the product is one of many elements towards a successful brand. The product tells some story, and the brand can tell a story as well. Product is king in the end. It is what sells. It is what people buy. It is what transmits that tangible asset of the brand, because obviously quality, function, price, etc. Emanates a lot more than perhaps a lot of brand messages do. And you do see that around a lot at the moment. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors and wording and marketing, and actually the product doesn't always stand up for that. So the trust element, it came through quite strongly and quite transparently, that what I would build in, the 5 principles that you build into a product, had to come through with the same message, as well as packaging, sustainability, cost, function, solution, etc. So that was also, those 5 principles stay with me on branding as much as the product itself.
So you've actually also worked at IKEA. So that's totally different, isn't it? Designing for a business like that and high end.
When I worked for IKEA, it was after I left John Lewis. So I worked for IKEA for 2 or 3 years as a freelancer from the studio in London. And that process was fascinating, because they almost retrofit the design. They give you a brief, you have certain parameters of time and budget, etc. They have a lot of research, they know exactly what they want to do, but they're not always sure how they're going to do that. And so the design is quite creative at the beginning, but as soon as you reach a certain point of the design, then you kind of retrofit that design into how much does it weigh, how large are the containers, how much is it going to cost to ship it, can we fit X amount on a pallet that goes in a container, 40-foot container, etc., etc. There's all the other elements that come into the logistics about your design, and it's not just about the design. But that was fascinating, the IKEA model. They work on thousands of different products. Only a very small percentage go through. They've actually got quite a small product range. I think it's only about 4,000 products, including various differences between each product. But what they do is they do it very well. I think actually, if any company is leading at the moment, it's certainly IKEA in that sphere. The amount of investment on R&D, and especially their factories and setups that I've seen across the world, is quite phenomenal, including the villages that are close by to the factories, and the kind of whole process about designing something for them involves a huge community. It's not just about the designer, which, for want of a better word, I suppose the Italian companies, over all the years I was there, it was very much about the designer first. The hierarchy of names, big, bold image of the designer plus their name, then the product, but very little around the sustainability or the story or the knock-on effects that a product would have when you introduce it. So things have changed a lot in the branding and the company worlds in that sense. They're much more transparent now, and you can quite clearly see that the messages that they're projecting is a lot about the benefits of a product rather than perhaps the status of a designer.
Yeah. So you've had quite a varied background. What type of business is your ideal client now, Ben?
Right. Well, typically right now, the type of client I have, again, I'm working from from a company in South Korea all the way over to the States, and a few in between. And all 4 of them approached me for product direction, essentially. So a creative direction, but based mainly about the product and about sourcing, designing, manufacturing, etc. But they slowly all spins off from that product selection or direction into the branding, visual identity, etc. So initially, they often have an idea of what they would like their brand or their new brand or their startup brand or an in-house brand within a big retailer. They have an idea of what they would like. But as they're very aware, as I am in the retail world, that from Crate and Barrel to John Lewis, for example, if I'm going to design a new range within that and incorporate a brand on it as well, it has to start with product. Because they all fundamentally, they have their brand, their overarching brand already. So it has to sit within and amongst a lot of other brands. And typically we start with with product development and the look and feel, and then grow into how that identity would fit around those types of products. So for example, the goal might be from one of these retailers that they want a pure recycled, pure sustainable brand. And we might, obviously, we start looking at manufacturers and materials and technology first before we even start designing. Then we look at the type of substrates or the products that can fit and be manufactured with this, which are completely sustainable right from scratch, including acid-free packaging, no glue, etc., right the way up to how it's delivered and warehoused. And then we grow into the product. And then obviously, eventually, you have to communicate that, including a name, a logo, the packaging, etc. So it all unfolds. And that's a sort of typical client I have at the moment. And they're big projects. I have very large teams, but they're all, actually my team is only 3 in the studio, but we have externals. And that's one thing I've learned very quickly in the last 5 years. The last thing I think you need these days is a studio with 50 people in it. You really need to go and identify the right resource with the right skill set to help you execute that. Because some of the clients I have might not be my taste. It might not be exactly what I would do. But you know, obviously you listen to the client and you understand what their needs are and their customer needs, and you adapt it to that. So that's another big change. It's not just about Theo and his personality. I'm there also to facilitate what my skill set is by using other skill sets to fit what the client needs.
Right. So how do you go about gathering a team together who can, say, do the copywriting, naming and all that?
Well, first of all, I have a roster of people over the years. But the main starting point is listening to the client. It's always quite intense meetings where we have an agenda, where we really dig deep into what the personality of the owners are, what the personalities of the people who are going to execute it, basically the in-house team, aligned with what the big goal of the retailer is. But then, of course, they're not all part of retailers. Some of them are startups with personal, people who just got a great idea. But digging into what their personality is the fundamental key there. And sometimes it's almost like a therapy session. You really have to push some buttons because it's not about what we're going to do. I think it's quite a famous saying. I forget the guy on YouTube pops up everywhere, Schneckel or something. And he often says it's nothing to do with what you're going to do. It's why you're doing it. And asking people why are they doing it, it's not so easy to answer. And that's the crux of it, understanding why you're going to do it, how you're going to do it, and then what you're going to do.
What do you do? And how does that impact what you do visually? I mean,
this is an interesting question because me personally, when I absorb all this information from clients, I'm already imagining, I'm already knitting together the future, and I often jump 5 years ahead, and I come back 4, 3, 2, 1 to the priority now, but often paint a picture which goes way over exactly what their goal was, their initial goal. But it's research obviously is key. Taking in all the key words from the client and their needs, and especially what their customer needs are. You end up painting a story, and storytelling is a lot what we do. But these days, the simplicity of that is so hard to find, because we often lose focus when I'm talking to a lot of the clients, what their core USP is, or what their most important product is, their most important service, and what they're really going to be focused on and known for. And I remember some years ago, I was in an art director's dinner, and the guy was talking about what was it? Most trusted. MTP, I think it was. And I was sitting there, and in the end, I put my hand up. I thought, well, everyone knows what an MTP is. And he said to me, "Where do you work?" I said, "John Lewis." And he said, "Well, what do you do? What do you do when you want to buy some curtains? You either phone your mum or you go to John Lewis." And he was talking about your most trusted person. And he was talking about how brand should be that. And often with these startups, and often they lose focus on what that actual core product is or service, and that's what you've got to flush out. And why do they do it? And as soon as you get anywhere near that and you understand it, you start to paint pictures in your mind, and instinctively you're starting to think of colours, card, paper, of a tone of voice, what the do's are, but certainly you make a huge list what the don'ts are, what not to do. So it is a bit of a therapy session at the beginning, and as soon as you get anywhere near that point of understanding of what the core focus should be, then it becomes much easier to paint the future.
Right. So how do you make sure that they're going to really stand out among their competitors and be seen in a different way?
Well, there's a couple of methods. I suppose the old, the marketing people, which it depends on what the clients are, but they're the bane of my life. I mean, they'll tell you everything that is what it's like today, and not what it's like in the future. So you constantly, the battles with marketing and budgets, and the whole country's been on discount for the last 10 years, 20% off, 50% off. The messaging and the marketing has got out of hand. And often my biggest battle is with marketing people. And so the vision that I try to put in place again is going 3 or 5 years ahead, and then pulling that back and trying to get the core fundamentals of the product and the tone around it, because people basically only have about 3 seconds. It's that first impression. The second you look at something, you generally appraise people from their clothes, you visually, then you go to all the different senses, etc. And you do make you summarize whether or not you like what you're looking at. But generally you take 3 seconds when you look at a bus advert or you pick up a product. And those values, ultimately in a product, in a service industry is one thing, but in a product industry, that tangible product has to stand up for all those values. And I think to communicate that, it has to be very transparent these days. I don't think a marketing bump and 2 for the price of 1 and so on, and especially in some of my clients, works anymore. I think people are very, very aware of what they're buying. They're very aware about value as price versus quality. They understand those 3 steps about what they're having. And I don't think they're believing the brands anymore. I think it's very clear on some of the projects I'm working on that they would rather believe in John down in Swansea and read his review, not what the brand is telling them. And definite mixed message there. And it's very much in Kingfisher, but making millions of pieces on B&Q and so on. All the research clearly showed that the less we said as a brand and the message-wise about how great we are, the more we focused on the benefits of the product, the more it fed into consumer reviews. And that's what drove sales, not what the brand was saying. So again, it came back to the product. So I think material, technology, quality, price, function, all these elements come into it. And that's the key thing these days. And quietening down perhaps the marketing message. Now, I say that quite easily. If you joined me an hour and a half ago on a Zoom call, you'd have heard me fighting for my life with the marketing people and budgets, etc., that they want the logo bigger and the discount sign bigger and so on. And yes, you do need a compromise, but I think this intangible message has to be human, it has to be empathetic, it has to be friendly, and it has to give you the benefit that you do understand, the consumer does know, and they do. It's not like some years ago.
Yeah, so you're talking with marketing then about how to advertise it, and
Yeah.
yeah,
Very much so. So this morning we were discussing about the imagery and about whether or not we use consumers in the imagery, otherwise, or we use a complete product in the imagery, or we mix the two together. For a PPE company that we're working on at the moment, it's quite obvious that the consumer needs a quick hit, those 3 seconds. So perhaps the hand sanitizer bottle needs to be the primary thing that they see. Perhaps somebody wiping their hands with the hand sanitizer is a different message, or if there's somebody staring at them with a quote telling them that they need this is another. And I often, with this kind of product, it's not because it's not, say, a functional product in the sense it's for your home. It's quite a personal product. It's quite a dilemma to decide, and we haven't decided yet which is the right message to give. I actually personally think that a close-up of the product with the hands might be better than actually a lifestyle image with everybody sitting in a front room being very content and happy because they bought this hand sanitizer, which is the sort of imagery you can buy off stock photography. And again, the marketing guys are very much focused on perhaps what their customers look like and their demographic and where they are. And they see a lifestyle image. Well, okay. I was a bit the other way. I was more about actually what this product can do for you.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. And how much freedom do you have to decide on the design?
Depends on the client. In South Korea, it's a huge company there. They're a spin-off part of the Samsung Group, and they've given me completely free rein. And again, it does depend on the client, but they want to tap into a market and a message and a product that they do not do. And so having my background from John Lewis and Habitat especially, they will sign over everything and they will believe in everything and follow exactly what you say to do, and amongst bringing in several externals as well to back that up. Research is a huge one for companies like that. So you need this foundation. You need numbers and figures, commercial research. I have agencies that find out what's going on in the market, what's not going on in the market to back all this up. And then on the other hand, I've got a client in Portugal that I'm working on, and I get very little room for movement, really. I'm just executing very much what they've done before, which they didn't do very well, but they want to undo and redo. So when you come to those types of rebranding, instead of starting from afresh, you tend to have less movement. But you know, I've got a mixed bag of skills, and commercially and creatively. And when they you know, what gets me the job often is what loses me the job. All the passion and energy I put into it, because sometimes I can do too much. But that's why they employ me, because they get quite a wide spectrum of this sort of creative input. I'm not a big agency, and I haven't got an agenda to pay 40 people in a studio. We'll bring those in as and when they need. So I personally tend to get quite a bit of freedom. And then, of course, we edit it down and find sometimes a compromise, or we find what we both like.
I was reading Byron Sharp. Have you read his book, How Brands Grow? It's sort of based on evidence-based marketing, where they look at the brands, and they were explaining how Tropicana lost sales because they rebranded and they wanted to look more premium and got rid of the orange from the box. And as a result, they were losing sales. So his view is that you have to be very careful how you rebrand.
Absolutely.
And, to preserve the assets that are actually working for the business.
We started several projects at John Lewis. I know I'm not particularly on record say all the detail about it, but you would have seen that they've rebranded recently. I think it was about 18 months ago. But again, I found that totally unnecessary. I think sometimes when retailers or brands feel that they are not, their turnover is slowing down, or perhaps they're not as fresh as they need to be, they often look at rebrand, and it's not the case. In fact, it can be detrimental as well. People do get very used to, if anybody didn't need a rebrand, I would argue, and they probably would tell me that I'm wrong on this, but if anyone didn't need a rebrand, it was John Lewis, because their brand is based on trust. I'm not sure it's about the direction of the stripe of their logo. I don't. No. I think, and I remember actually, just something came to mind. When I was studying at college, I remember reading about Chanel or Dior launching a new perfume, and they were selling very, very well, but they were selling to the wrong type of customer, like the scale, I think a customer C or D, lower. Now you would think that was great. This was probably 20 years ago, but they redid the campaign using a Salvador Dali painting dripping over the bottle. The sales went down less than half, but they were selling back to the A's and B's, and they preferred that. So I can tend to agree with him. I haven't read the book, but and I should read more books. I do make notes and think I'm going to read these books, but I think when you're doing it every day, I will take that. I just made a note of that book. But
it's on audio.
It's quite dangerous just to rebrand when you think that it will make that big a difference. And I swear to God, it comes back to the product king in the end, and the 5 kind of principles: form, function.
We'll take a short break at this point, as I'd like to mention the Brand-tuned series of webinars, which support founders to think through their brand, taking IP into account at the right time, which is before you make firm decisions about what to create. Just visit brandtuned.com and the webinars are referenced right there on the homepage. Okay, back to the podcast now. So when I see a design like you're mentioning John Lewis, is it just a matter of somebody's preference as to whose design they like best, or is there actually something intrinsically better about one design than another?
I love that question. I wish if that question in a room full of creative directors, my God. You know what? I shouldn't say yes, but I think it is. I think there is definitely a knack to this, and there's an experience that comes with it. And, I'm not most articulate and so on. I'm not a brand guru, read the books and all these kind of things. But I think it does. I think it really does come down to preference. And I think, when I look back at the house brand that we developed at John Lewis, which was huge success after I left, they wanted a habitat look and feel for a different type of audience. They picked on the right person. It does come down to who they give the who they delegate the job to, their type of personality. And I would spend the first 3 months at John Lewis writing, drawing and Googling and just putting to the books and books and books of images and things. And then I just have a gut instinct for it. And if it does come down to that personality of that person or agency that you choose, when you're starting completely afresh and you give them that authority, it's very different if you've got parameters about customer needs and so on, like we mentioned earlier. But when they need to just invent something for a completely new audience, it does come down to the personality of the team that you employ. And then, of course, John Lewis, we would call in copywriters, and I would just stand up and talk for an hour. And then they would come up with the strap lines, picking out on keywords. We would go to Pentagram, a very big agency, a super good agency. Again, Harry Pierce was the guy who did the logo for us. And talking, we'd get to know each other. And then suddenly he would understand this urgency or this passion about the product and how that's king. And then the logo shouldn't be too overbearing, or the name, and therefore from a distance you can spot the circle with the orange in it and the silhouette of the product. And it is quite instinctive. On the other hand, I've contradicted myself a bit, I suppose, because there is a science to it as well. But this multinational I'm working on at the moment for the PPE is, it's instinctive. I made the presentation today, the graphics, the look and the feel. It's tailored to what they need for their kind of B2B customers. But you can see my personality in it. You can see what I believe that design should be like, especially on the communication, the graphics, and simple and spot colors and so on. It's not over the top. So I perhaps should put up a bigger argument for the whole industry, but I do think there's just quite a lot of instinct in there. I really do. And that instinct comes from good creative directors know who to use. When you need an illustration, thousands of illustrators, photographers. I go through hundreds of portfolios, and suddenly I just see it, and that's it. She uses natural light. She's got deep focus, depth of field, whatever it might be. You suddenly recognize it, and it's how to knit those things together that creates a great brand. So it is driven by instinct as much as it is logic, I think.
Interesting. So which brand do you particularly admire for their design, and why?
Well, I admire what I see lots and lots of brands. I can't really think of one in particular, but what I do really appreciate and I stand back and look at is the consistency of brands and the coordination that they have and how flexible they are. I see, you go to Whole Foods or you go to the Apple shop, you go to big department stores, etc. And what I love is this consistent coordination, but it's very flexible. So I see how they come out with seasonal things or new product ranges, etc. But the fundamentals of the brand are always there. And I've struggled to come up with names, really, because there are a lot out there. And, if we even look at Apple, for example, it's so easy just to say Apple. But to be honest, they don't do much. They got beautifully consistent and coordinated, but it's not hugely flexible like you might have thought some years ago as far as their advertising and their the promotion, so on. But they stick to their fundamental principles constantly, and that's what I like about particular brands when they're coordinating, they're consistent in their message. But there's hundreds. I'd have to have a think about it and send you a
So by consistent, you mean consistent messaging rather than using the brand elements in a consistent way, like their logo and tagline and things.
Yeah, a consistency in that sense that you can, I can spot it obviously that a creative has been behind it. You can see it quite easily when a marketing person has been behind it, and so it is about the consistency of their templates, their logos, their grids, etc., the way their web page works and so on. But it's also about the consistency, not just the brand message, but also about the product or the service they provide, because that logic and magic needs to combine, and you can't just have it in just logic, and you can't just have magic to some extent. It's that mix, but with the consistency of the brand always there. And that can just be simply logo, tone of voice, message, color, imagery, etc. But you see so many brands out there at the moment, especially a lot of startups. It's not a cheap thing to start up everything from scratch, and some of the graphics are extremely simple and I think very beautiful, because photography is expensive. Web pages are expensive to build. There are assets that you need to communicate the brand, whether it's video, print, books, brochures, web, etc. That often come before you start selling, and you do see a lot of startups who are extremely simple, a lot in the cosmetic world at the moment, with pure new creams and so on. Very simple, beautiful. And I often wonder, because really they're focused just on their product, and the graphics are just sat in place on top of the purity of their product, and they've not tried to sell it to me. And in sometimes quite a vulgar way. I think I often see adverts and think it's unbelievable, how they kind of, especially American adverts, to be honest. I've been looking at a lot of those recently about the PPE, and their whole approach, so through some of the research, is to scare you to death. If you don't buy this, you're a goner. I mean, they're not telling me the gloves have been dipped in alcohol. They're showing me a guy touching something and then rubbing his nose, and the advert comes up with a big coronavirus green and red thing saying you're done for. And panic buying. No, it doesn't show me about. They point out the wastage of disposable masks and showing a turtle in the sea, but they don't tell me anything about their sustainability. But they point out where everybody else is going wrong, and it's the kind of, so I could tell you a lot what I don't like, but
Yeah, so the brand has to live basically by its ideals and consistently throughout all the messaging and ads and everything.
Yeah, there's lots from, especially some UK ones, furniture makers and so on, and it does, and it does come down to that. Probably even after 5 or 10 years, it will come back to what you did in your first couple of months and those principles. Because if you paired it all the way back and you have one product or service that started you off, it will always come around full circle to that. And whether or not you base that on price, the quality of the material, the product itself, or the service you provide, it might come down to just trust. And to be honest, these days that can disappear in a second, and through reviews, and consumers got huge power at the moment. I think retailers are very worried about it. You can't bluff these people. You can't bluff the consumer like you used to be able to. Right down from Primark to John Lewis to the higher end brands, the prices of things. I mean, I've been briefed recently to try and see if I could sort out a range of furniture for a retailer and this sub brand that they've got. And, when you look at what's happened the last 3 months with the pandemic, you think, my God, do we really need another side table? It's like, I'm struggling. I haven't really got back to them on it because there are some priorities there. And I think my advice to a lot of these guys that have contacted me, especially on the product side, would be to look at the ranges and the methods of the sustainability, the logistics, the glues, all the bits behind it. I mean, working at Kingfisher, the sustainability is not a recycled symbol on a craft box in Whole Foods. It's just changing the size of the packaging and reducing the scale of a product to fit in a certain way, a bit like the IKEA model. We redesigned some products that calculated that was 30 less trucks a week on the streets because you're moving air around as much as you are anything else. When I'm working with IKEA, they're absolute genius. I take my hat off to them for that. And they base a lot of their principles and the brand on those types of actions, not just the marketing message. They really live and breathe it, to answer your question, is why I particularly admire brands when they really do live and breathe it. And a lot of customers would never see that behind the scenes. But I think slowly the big successful ones, they do. And smaller ones, much more than they used to as well. I mean, this whole designer maker at the moment, and the middle ground has been almost disappeared. There's the high end, and the middle ground's gone down to the more spread out more. And there's more startups, there's more individuals who obviously can get web pages, go direct to customer. They don't have to go through other retailers or wholesale. These trade shows are perhaps not so, maybe a thing of the past. And getting that visibility is one of the key things. And we have people who are experts on SEO and internet, wording, Google, Instagram, and this social media platform. And I don't like it completely, but my God, you need to do that really well because the visibility you get is enormous. And if you can back it up with the trust, and the first impression of that brand are your values, including what the product is, I think people can succeed very well these days, and people will come back, and word of mouth is so important.
Yeah, so what I've taken away also from this Byron Sharp's book is that you need to be top of mind, available, present for people to buy you wherever they are looking, and, uniquely yourself. So you need to be very distinct and recognizable.
Yeah, you do. And for the fundamental principles, between architects, designers, and fashion people. And when you come back down to the graphic design, it does have a big role in that. You need shelf life. You do need visibility on the shelf, in the window. You do only get these 3 seconds to communicate it. Yeah. Logos are clear, loud, spot colors. You do have to fight for your space. And there are brave brands out there that are not so they can take that risk, and they can perhaps project something completely new, but it's not always so successful at the beginning. And so sometimes if you go and challenge your competitors graphically, which you see a lot of similarities, but when you look at this PPE at the moment we're working on, it's nigh on impossible to get away from blue or green as a communication tool because it's quite clinical, the color, and so on. They're scared stiff, this multinational. We're looking at the scale between clinical and cosmetic. And, that barometer, you call it, that scale, it goes back and forth. You have to align it to get your shelf visibility and your message over graphically, not about the value, but just simply to get the attention of someone. And, the guys in Portugal are fantastic, taking the lead and being very brave, what we've done. The multinational, of course, believes, bigger, louder, better, bullying with huge marketing budgets, which, they win in the end. A lot of these, I've worked with a big drinks company recently and make soft drink, and but they're not quite as good as their biggest competitor. I can't say who it is, but they throw billions on the word design, but it's all based about marketing and endorsement by celebrities and so on. And it is successful, that model, but I think we'll see a bit less and less of that, because the pyramid at the moment is getting very wide and thick, and very good quality startups and brands at the bottom are run by small individuals, small companies. They're not all right at the top anymore, and certainly in the middle, whereas the retailers, I would argue, like John Lewis and so on, I think the bigger retailers are going to have a bit of a problem. They're going to get squeezed because fundamentally they only sell everybody else's stuff. They have a percentage of their own brand, but sooner or later they're going to have to go out and wholesale their own products to others, because selling it's a price war otherwise. Never understood. You really these days on the internet, and you are going to be driven by price for sure, depending on what the product is. But these smaller brands, which are becoming bigger and bigger at the bottom of the pyramid, have got this quality. You can return to them. There's this trust. It's a bit more personal. It's a bit more empathetic. It's not just in your face selling. You feel there's stories behind it. You've got a guy down in Cornwall with a lathe making his candles or whatever he's doing. There's tons of little stories popping up all over the place, which is lovely.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Theo, for appearing on the show. How can people find you? In the show notes, we want to mention how they can find you.
We could do it through my theowilliams.com. It's still
okay.
Under construction for years, but it's got stuff on it, but it's not, after all I've spoken about, I wouldn't say it represents me that well. But anyway, theowilliams.com would be great. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much indeed, then. That's it for this week. Do subscribe to the Brandtuned newsletter to get weekly updates. I'd also love to get your feedback. Just send me an email to info@brandtuned.com. Finally, if you liked the episode, please do share it with your friends and colleagues and review it on iTunes or whichever platform you use to listen to podcasts. If you leave us a 5-star review, it means more people will listen and we can spread the word much more quickly about the podcast. Thank you, and bye for now.